You're listening to the Swap Society podcast, and I'm your host, Nicole Robertson. I interview thought leaders and change makers who are working to create a more sustainable and equitable world through fashion, art, and activism. Join us for a dose of climate optimism as we envision a brighter future. Hey everyone, welcome to the Swap Society podcast. Today I'm talking with Remake's Director of Community Engagement and Education, Emily Stochl. Remake is a community of fashion lovers, women rights advocates, and environmentalists who are on a mission to change the fashion industry's harmful practices on people and our planet. Emily is also the host of Preloved Podcast. Hi, Emily. Thank you so much Thank you so much for being on the show. So where are you talking to us from today?
I am calling from Cedar Rapids, Iowa, which is in the central Midwest, United States.
Amazing. Midwest. I'm from Chicago. So
all right.
Another Midwesterner here. So please share a bit about your background and how you got into sustainable fashion.
Absolutely. Well, first of all, thanks so much for having me on the show. It's just a delight to be speaking with another remaker today. Like you said, I'm Emily. I'm the host and creator of Preloved Podcast. I make content about vintage, thrifting, climate activism, sustainability. You can find me across the internet as at Emily M. Stochl. But my sustainability journey actually started with labor activism. So my grandma, who was really very involved with my upbringing, was a labor activist. She worked in a plastics factory and was a single mom raising 6 kids. I have a little picture of her here since we're on video.
Yeah, let's see. Aww.
So she was a third parent to me, was very, very involved in my upbringing, took me to school every day while my parents worked, ate most of our dinners together, so very much a third parent to me. And I just know from hearing about her experiences as a single mom, raising 6 kids, working a factory job, often working nights, just the struggles that she had to go through. But I also, it wasn't just a story of struggles, because it was also a story of the protections that her union offered her. So if you think back to when my grandma was raising my dad, for example, in the 60s and 70s, she had strong union protections at that time, which is just something that a lot of workers don't have today. And so she was able to band together with her coworkers to be a part of walkouts when they found out that the women on the factory line weren't being paid the same as the men, or, when they needed to fight for worker protections. And so I grew up with those values, those worker solidarity values from her. And it's funny because if I think back to how I got into sustainable fashion, I just started thrifting as a teenager. When I could drive, it was the thing that I could do that I could afford with, low income teenage job. And it was just what the fun, quirky kids did. So thrifting was what I did. And kind of all throughout college, it was that way. I was very much like a hipster kid, and that was what the hipster kids did. But it didn't connect together to me that this was a part of my value system. I think now a lot of people who get into it have that connection from the get-go, but that wasn't necessarily the experience for me. Around the time, of the Rana Plaza factory collapse, around the time of the True Cost documentary, I also read Elizabeth Klein's book Overdressed around this similar time. This was all happening right around when I was graduating from college. And I already loved thrifting so much. It was already how I got 90% of my clothes, that it was a very easy answer for me to just not take part in the big fashion system any longer and to focus on secondhand. And it's really all just gone on from there. I, shortly after met a friend who had opened a vintage shop in our town here. And I started, working some shifts at the vintage shop with her, got very deep down, the wonderful world that is conscious fashion and sustainability and vintage. And at that time, then I could really say that I felt like it was something that connected to my value system. And so then that leads into how I both started Preloved Podcast Podcast and got involved with Remake because I was learning so much about conscious fashion and sustainable fashion at the time. And I think it's totally different now, but back then, this was probably like 2016, 2017, there wasn't a ton of conversation about thrifting happening in the sustainable fashion space. It was mostly about conscious fashion brands, which is so great, like small and ethical brands. But I was still, a young 20 something on a budget trying to make my way in the world. And I just didn't have the budget for those cool sustainable brands. And, I wasn't hearing folks talking about participating in sustainable fashion through the secondhand world, which was my connection to it. And so I decided that since I couldn't find a podcast about that topic that I wanted to hear about, that I would start it. So that's why I started Preloved Podcast back in 2018. And now I feel like secondhand and vintage fashion is like such a big part of the sustainable fashion conversation. It's totally different now. There are so many more podcasts, resources, YouTube channels, which I just love to see. Like I love to see so many more champions of secondhand because I think it's always been a big part of the movement. It just hasn't been given its center stage. Mm-hmm. And then early days of the podcast, I had Remakes founder Aisha Barenblatt on my show, and she was one of the first guests I interviewed, and it was right when Remake was launching their ambassador program. And so I came on board as an ambassador and was with them ever since. I was a really active Remake ambassador, and when Remake's campaigning work, which I'm sure we're going to talk about a lot on today's show, when that really started to ramp up in 2020, I came on board the core team to kind of support the ambassador community in that campaigning work.
That's amazing. Yeah. And just kind of to dial back a smidge, I mean, I am absolutely team secondhand, as you can imagine. I mean, I think that it's amazing that we have more and more brands that are embracing, sustainability and ethical labor practices and all of those things that the fashion industry really needs. But there's so much clothing in the world that needs to be worn. And, and I think that, when I hear people talk about how, you shouldn't thrift if you have a certain income level, or you shouldn't flip thrifts or whatever, I'd love to hear your perspective on that. I just will quickly say that I don't think that that's the right approach to the conversation, because the bottom line is that we have an abundance of secondhand clothing, and most of it is winding up in the global south or landfilled or incinerated. And we need to keep this clothing in circulation. And for someone who's so entrenched in secondhand, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I feel like this, kind of sprang up on online conversation as more and more folks were getting into secondhand. And I agree very much with you. I think that the reason that this comes up is because folks just don't understand the secondhand system deeply. It's been marketed as a very different system than what it is. So there's very good reason why it's not understood complexly. But essentially, the way that the secondhand system works and has always worked, the secondhand system has been around for over 100 years. Even some of the big charity shops that, we're very familiar with today, Goodwill, Salvation Army, these have been around for hundreds of years. And the way that it functions is that those charity shops realized that clothing was a resource that people would be happy to donate for free. And then those charities could resell that clothing in order to make a profit that they could use to fund a charitable mission. And what that charitable mission is ranges across the board. So it's, of course, really important when you're engaging with a secondhand shop to make sure that, you also are aligned with that charitable mission. But like clothing isn't the mission, I guess I would say. Clothing is the profit engine that makes the charitable mission run. And I think that's the first big misunderstanding about the way that the secondhand system works. I think a lot of people are under the misconception that the secondhand system there is there to clothe, and it is. I'm not saying it isn't, but the primary goal of those organizations and what drives the decisions that they make is to fund a charitable cause. And then the second thing is just the volume of clothes. We have way too much clothing in existence. There is no way that we can ever, at this current time, make a scarcity argument about anything having to do with clothes. There's more clothing than we could ever need, ever use. A big problem is that it is cheap clothing, that it's not clothing that's meant to last for a very long time. And that's a whole separate issue that we could get into. But there is by no means a scarcity of clothing. Charity shops are in fact unable to deal with all the clothing that they receive. There's too much clothing for them to process and be able to sell. And often the stat that is used is that about 10 to 20% of what is donated to the charity shop actually ends up being resold in the charity shop. There's in fact so much more that they are exporting it to other places. And, if we just look at that logically, if there was a shortage of clothing to supply to local communities, why would the charity shops be going to the step to export the clothing? So we know that those two things aren't true, but I do understand. I think it's a well-meaning question. People should ask questions about the secondhand system. Like, we shouldn't just accept that the secondhand system is this moral good, because it is it's a fashion system, and we've been so blind to the way that the firsthand fashion system works and deceived by greenwashing. So I think it's good that people are asking those questions. But what I like to tell people, if that's a concern, or if they're feeling guilt about spending money in charity shops, which I personally don't feel is something that they should feel guilt about, what I like to tell them is that instead of stopping shopping at thrift shops, what would actually be more impactful is if you were able to donate your time or your resources to the secondhand ecosystem, because so many other things, how we shop isn't actually the way to make the biggest difference. It's how we participate in other ways, right? So if you are a person with economic privilege or time privilege, great, get involved in your community charity shop. They need you. And your input of time or your input of monetary resources, if you don't have time to give, that is going to impact the members of your community that lack economic privilege, that you're concerned about, so much more so than just not buying clothing from that thrift store would.
Yeah, no, thank you. I think that that's a really great way to think about it. And it is very complex. And I think that it's so great that there are more and more people that are engaging in the secondhand system, that are thinking about how they get dressed and, what the implications are for the greater good and, other people in the world. So let's get back to Remake.
Yeah.
For those who are learning about Remake for the first time, please tell us about Remake's mission and the incredible work the team is doing.
Yeah, so Remake is a nonprofit organization. We're a 501c3, and we work in the space of gender and climate justice in the fashion industry. So our mission is to make fashion a force for good. And we do this in a couple of different ways. We do education for our community. We do our own research and fact-filled stories. We produce independent documentaries, short films. We also are training up the next generation of fashion activists. And so this is kind of the core of the exciting work that I get to do, is leadership development for our global ambassador community. We have over 1,100 ambassadors all around the globe here today. If you are interested in getting more involved in fashion activism, we'd love to have you as part of that volunteer corps. And we basically, provide opportunities for those ambassadors to get to know each other, to network, to develop their skills as activists, and to lock into Remake campaigns, because they're the core of the movement and they make change happen. Remake also does excellent work in addition to our campaigning work in the space of transparency and accountability. So we produce a fashion accountability report where we analyze mostly big fashion brands about the impact that they're making and provide constructive criticism, I suppose we can say, about how they could improve. But yeah, that's a little bit about what we do. The goal is, of course, for the fashion industry to be a force for good, like I said, for people and planet. And Remake is really doing work in that intersection of people and planet. We focus on the labor and the climate impacts in everything we do.
That's amazing. And I think that's so important. You know, and the way that I think about sustainable fashion in terms of, you know, its definition is that sustainability encompasses both the environment and the labor, because I feel like the human piece is just as important as the environmental piece. I know that not everyone thinks of it that way, but I'm that's one of the things that I love about Remake is that it's, you know, there are so many incredible organizations doing important work around this space, but I love that it's a mix of both, because we really need to tackle all sides of this problem.
We absolutely do. And it's so great that you see it that way and that our community does. It's not the way the brands see it. So very often brands, will clamor to make claims to sustainability progress, but ethics and labor tends to lag far behind. And so we're there to remind them that they're accountable to both people and planet.
So were you a volunteer with Remake before you came on board more formally? And is that, can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. So like I said, when they started up the ambassador community back in 2018, I joined up. That's our volunteer core. So I was a part of that lovely community. And then 2020 Remake really started to grow. Our ambassador community started to grow. We got, very active in campaigning with things like the Pay Up Fashion campaign and the Garment Worker Protection Act, which I know we're going to talk about here today. And so that was when I was brought on the team to work with the staff, basically to help the ambassadors get more activated. So give them ways that they could take action. And it's been an exciting ride because it's a powerful community and they do so much great work, and I'm impressed by them every day.
That's amazing. I mean, I don't know about you, but I feel like I started thrifting in college, which was a pretty long time ago, but I really got into it. I loved finding unique, interesting, especially vintage pieces. And but I still shopped at other places. You know, I still shopped in department stores, and I've even bought fast fashion in my life, although it wasn't really called fast fashion back then, but it's one of those things where I love that I've found so many of my people. I feel like the more, now that I'm working in the space and I have a business in the space, I'm like, oh my God, I've found my people. And not just because it's like, oh, they like finding cool vintage clothes, which obviously that's something I could connect with someone on. And that's a fun part of it. But just finding the people that are really passionate about the environment and other people and care about working conditions for their fellow humans. And it's like, oh my God, I found my people. So it must feel so incredible to be in that role where you're working with so many volunteers that have so much excitement and love for the same things that you care about.
It is. I mean, it's empowering to know we're not alone, right? Like the model of Remake is that grassroots change maker model, that it takes a critical mass of people to make a difference. And we, have built up that community, and we hope that it is a community that is fun and gives back to them. We hope that they build friendships within the community. I know that I have. There are Remake folks that I talk to every day that are some of my very close friends. So we want them to be able to network with each other, to support each other, to learn alongside each other, and then to know that when it's time to go out and campaign, that there are others around them, because this work isn't, it's not work that can be done with just one person. It's work that takes a collective.
So I know that Remake is based in San Francisco area. You're in the Midwest. I know there are people all over the country. Has Remake focused primarily in the United States, or is it also more international?
Yeah, so it is a global community. We have ambassadors from all over the world. Something that we started doing during the pandemic to just provide a little bit more localized support to our communities where there are a lot of Remake ambassadors was we have community organizers in different cities where there are a lot of ambassadors. So, the places you would think of like New York, LA, the Bay Area, Seattle, DC. But we also have community organizers in some cities internationally where we have a lot of Remake ambassadors. So we have community organizers that represent Canada, London, the Netherlands. Oh, it's getting risky naming them because then I'm going to forget folks. But we've brought on recently community organizer to represent Italy and one to represent our South Asian regional ambassadors. So we truly are a global community. We're a small organization, but we're trying to put that like next level of support in place so that there are local champions, local leaders who are carrying out that Remake mission across the globe.
That's so exciting. So Swap Society has partnered with Remake in the past for No New Clothes campaign. How has the No New Clothes movement grown over the years, and what can we expect to see for this year's campaign?
Yes, we are so excited for the No New Clothes campaign. We're in the early days of planning it, but what you can expect is it will launch on June 1st. It's always our summer campaign. And the idea behind No New Clothes is it's a 90-day pledge of no new clothes. And so we ask people, I think that this is the first step. A lot of times when people get into the sustainable fashion conversation, they'll ask, where should I shop that's more sustainable? A good question to ask, a very commonly asked question, but we actually think that the first thing people should do if they're just getting into this is to take 90 days of not buying anything new, because 90 days is about the amount of time that researchers, trainers, dietitians say that it takes to build a habit that lasts. And so we're applying that to your shopping habits. If you take 90 days of not buying anything new and instead use that time to reflect on how you shop, we really believe that it will change your relationship to fashion and to consumption. And we think that's builds a really strong foundation for you going forward. So during No New Clothes, it's also a super fun time where we get to bring together programs, both educational programs and social opportunities to mix and mingle with folks doing work in the secondhand space, working in pre-loved businesses, which I just so love to be able to offer a platform to folks doing that work. It's really exciting. It's a really great first step into Remake's work. So if you're listening today and you're like, oh, I think I could do that, I'd love to give that a try, definitely sign up for the pledge this summer.
Yeah, and I think taking a pledge, it's obviously nobody's going to be making sure you're doing it, but I think as an individual, when you take a pledge, right, you're going to be more likely to stick with it. And I think it's also cool to know that people all around the world are doing the same thing and, taking a break from buying new clothes. But I do want to mention that secondhand is not included in the pledge, correct?
Right. It's just nothing new.
Brand new.
Our brand new. So that's our opportunity to celebrate secondhand, right? And you're exactly right. Like 1,500 people usually take the pledge. That's how many we're counting on, that or more this year. So it is a community. We have we're going to organize little meetups and a newsletter with some reflection questions. So people feel like they're doing it, with friends, which can also be really helpful when it comes to building a habit.
Yeah, absolutely. And when I started swapping in 2010, I had already been a secondhand shopper, but around 2010 is when I learned the facts and the truths, the hard truths about the fashion industry. And I just thought, oh man, I don't really want to be a part of this. And I was looking for a way to mix up my wardrobe in a way that was like easy and fun and sustainable and, didn't rely on me going out and shopping and buying new things. I didn't plan on doing a shopping ban or even just, a break. It just kind of happened. I mean, since then, I basically don't buy new clothes. I haven't bought new clothes in so long. I mean, obviously, socks and undies and things like that. But what I want to say to anyone out there who's thinking about taking the No New Clothes Pledge this summer, but they feel nervous about it, like it might be really hard or scary or this crazy thing to do, it's really not as hard as it might seem. And once you start doing it and you just have that kind of shift in your mindset and you see, one, that you don't really need to buy new stuff all the time. You have so many things in your closet already that you can wear.
Yeah.
And be creative with the clothes that are already in your closet, number one. Number two, there's so much amazing secondhand out there. So if you're not already a secondhand shopper, it's a great time to explore thrifting, swapping, whatever gets you excited or whatever seems like a fun way to do it, whether it's online or in person. And yeah, I mean, I think it's good to just check in with yourself. We live in such a consumeristic society that puts such a strong emphasis on buy all the time. And, oh, you're not trendy anymore. The trend changed. Ha, got to buy this new thing. Got time to get rid of the old thing. And it's like, it's all just really marketing. And,
it is. Yeah.
And this like insane culture that humans have created. But anyway, I'm so excited. We're always really excited to help spread the word about the No New Clothes campaign and, get involved and help get people to take the pledge. And so I think it's just exciting to see that it's still going and that it's growing. The next thing that I want to talk about, though, and you mentioned it earlier, is, last year Remake was very involved with SB 62, the Garment Worker Protection Act. And it was so exciting. I remember when I learned that Governor Newsom had signed it, I started crying. I was driving my kids home from school and I was in the car and I just started crying. And one of my sons said, "What's wrong, Mommy?" And I was like, "Oh, it's happy tears. I'm really happy. I'm really excited." It's so great to have a win here or there, right? Yeah. Especially like working in activism and, trying to rally people behind a cause is so much work. And then when you get a win, when you get a success, it's so great. But as we know, that doesn't solve all of the fashion world's ills. But I'd love to check in and just hear, how has the passage of SB 62 impacted garment workers so far? And what's the current status there?
Yeah. So just for a little bit of quick background. So in the United States, LA is the largest apparel production hub in the US. And even though the US, we might think of workers having some modicum of protections because we have minimum wage laws, things like this. In fact, sweatshop conditions are pervasive here in the US. In Los Angeles, we were seeing garment workers making far below the minimum wage, often making somewhere in the range of $3 to $5 an hour. The minimum wage in California is $15 an hour. So a third of what the legal minimum wage in the state is. So how is this happening? There had been a kind of loophole around the minimum wage law that was being utilized in California called piece rate pay. And so this basically means that the makers were being paid by the t-shirt that they sewed or by the legs of the jeans that they sewed, by the piece rather than by the hour. And when those wages would be calculated out this way, that would really drive down what the hourly wage was. And so what actually happened when the organizing of the Garment Worker Protection Act came to be, it was a garment worker led fight, which is really so important. And I think that's why it was so successful, because it accurately, it went after what the garment workers had identified were their core issues. So they were saying that we have to eliminate piece rate pay. This is what is holding us back from making higher wages in the state of California. So it started there. But then the second thing that garment makers felt the law had to address was the fact that there's no one to go to hold accountable if they're not getting paid what they're supposed to be getting paid. So, previously they were not getting paid the minimum wage, but how is that going to be enforced? Who can they go to make that complaint and have it addressed? And who's accountable? Brands and factories like to do this thing where they pass accountability for garment makers back and forth. They say, oh, well, it's subcontracted here, it's not our employee here. And the reality of this is that brands know full well that they are driving a system that creates conditions for sub-minimum wages. They truly hold all of the power in these conversations when it comes to the way that they are pricing their pieces so low and the fast timelines that they are demanding for production. They're creating this system where, of course, people are being paid below the minimum wage. So that's what the Garment Worker Protection Act, or as it's sometimes called SB 62, because it's Senate Bill 62 in the state of California. It addresses those two things. And after the garment makers, came together with lawmakers to work up this bill, it was, a hard fight for about 2 years worth, of the bill becomes a law process. It has to go through many different steps along the way, many committees, many approval processes. But the bill was passed, and also the thing I should say here too is we were we were up against big challengers, right? There are big fashion brands that and recognize: Fashion Nova, Forever 21, Harley Davidson, Urban Outfitters, Charlotte Russe, even Disney, produce in California. And so it's no small feat when it comes to convincing lawmakers to put this law in place and to side with the garment makers here. But huge victory. The bill was passed into law in October 2021, and then it went into effect in January 2022. So garment maker wages in California essentially tripled to meet the legal minimum wage, which is just incredible when you think about the hard 2 years of work that the coalition spent working on the bill, the many years prior that the garment makers spent conceptualizing this bill and all that work that went into it. And I think what's so incredible about the Garment Worker Protection Act is that this, being a part of this from my perspective, was a true masterclass in how you build a coalition, because the work for this brought together workers and ethical brands and the Remake fashion activism community and press and professors and experts. So many people came together. And because of that, and because they all brought their different perspectives and their different skills that they could add to the organizing work, we achieved real political power. And that's what Remake is pushing for, is to actually reform the fashion industry. So now those workers are protected by the law. The other really cool thing about the Garment Worker Protection Act is it's not only monumental, but it also is really precedent setting. So piece rate pay, unfortunately, is all too common within the United States. I'm in the Midwest, so I think of agriculture. Piece rate pay is rampant in agriculture. There are, industries like gig work that need reform that protects the hourly minimum wage, that is meant to protect workers, right? And so passing that at a state level really sets a precedent for what it could look like for other industries, of course, for garment makers outside of California, and of course, the ultimate goal, protecting all garment makers around the world. So it's a really impressive legislative win. And the true reality of what it has meant for the Garment Worker Protection Act to go into law is that real life benefit of workers being paid the legal minimum wage, and thinking about just their wages, in some cases tripling or more, as that law went into effect. Like that is impacting thousands of real life people, and their daily lives.
It's so exciting. Yeah. And to think like, oh, wow, a tripling of their wages. I mean, that's so impactful for individuals and families. But as someone who lives in Los Angeles, I will tell you that I just can't even fathom trying to live in LA on $5 an hour or $3 to $5. I mean, it's just crazy. It's just absolutely crazy.
It's criminal. I mean, yeah.
Yeah. And that there were so many businesses opposed to this law. Obviously it hits their bottom line, but we have to look at that triple bottom line as a society, people, planet, and profit, not just profit. And it's so exciting to know that that's changing the lives of so many people here locally. And hopefully, to your point, it can be, since it is so precedent setting, a direction for things to come. The piece rate really is just a loophole to take advantage of workers. And so I'm glad that it's moving away. And I do think that one of the things that made SB 62 successful, to your point about everybody coming together, but there were also a number of business signatories, we were, Swap Society included, where we were saying, okay, we're businesses in California and we think that this should happen. And so it wasn't even just workers against businesses, right? There was a mix of people coming forward and saying, no, yeah, we should pay people at least minimum wage.
Right, because it's not a level playing field, right, for ethical businesses. And so, I should think that having this law in place is an incentive for ethical businesses to want to start up in California. It could be the start of making a hub of ethical business in Los Angeles, which would be such a cool future result of this bill passing.
Absolutely. And I know that there are a lot of people here that would love for LA to kind of become this sustainable fashion capital, so to speak.
Yeah.
And I think that we have the tools and could make that happen. So what is Remakes Focus this year, and what can we expect to see in the months ahead?
Absolutely. So Remakes advocacy focus is always on getting the makers, getting predominantly the people who make our clothes are women. So getting the women who make our clothes paid fairly. That is always what drives us in our advocacy and campaigning work. And I would say if you want to stay in touch with Remakes work, if you want to be a part of this work, we would love to have you. Please follow us on social media. Our handles are at Remake Our World. We would love to see you for No New Clothes this summer. It's a great way to get started. And once you get started, I guarantee you will fall in love with this community and want to be a part of it. And yeah, look forward to more ways of coming together and change makers making a difference.
Amazing. So I love a good fashion love story.
Me too.
And obviously I think people like us, we got excited about fashion and vintage or secondhand or what have you. And maybe we came to it from advocacy or from fashion or both, but we were fashion lovers, right? So all of these conversations are really important about how it works and how we can be better and how we can make the world better through fashion. But what's your favorite piece in your closet right now and why?
So a favorite piece for me, and it's still cold here in Iowa, so I'm still wearing it often, but I actually have my late dad's high school Letterman jacket, and it's such a good piece. And it's sort of a miracle that it fits me because my dad was, 6'2", 6'3". He was a linebacker. He was a big man. And I am a short, small lady. And so this must have been from pre-growth spurt or something. But it's his high school Letterman jacket and it fits me. And my dad is no longer with us. And so it's a little piece of him that I get to have with me all the time. And so it's really just so meaningful. But choosing between my vintage pieces is kind of like, choosing between children. I think I love them all so much. I can see a little clothing rack back here. I'm planning for some events that are coming up and I'm seeing the sleeve of a dress that I absolutely love. It reminds me, it's not Gucci, but it reminds me of Gucci because it's like red and green chevron print on there. And it's 70s and it's got a dagger collar and these really beautiful medallion gold buttons. And the woman who owned it previously wrote her name on the inside tag. Her name was Ida Bell Walker, which I just think has a romance to it in itself. And so I love that dress. I wore it in a fashion show that our vintage shop put on right before the pandemic. I haven't had a great occasion to wear it yet again, but I know I'm going to be stepping out in it again soon. So very excited.
That's so exciting. Yeah, I mean, there are so many sentimental pieces out there, and that's amazing that you get to wear your dad's Letterman jacket. Yeah. I love that. That's so great. So, what are you reading right now? I follow you, so I know you're a reader.
I am a reader. So I just started a great book of essays, which is called Goodbye to All That. And the title is based on the Joan Didion essay, Goodbye to All That, which is my favorite essay by the late, great Joan Didion, who we lost this year. And basically, Joan Didion is a Californian, but lived in New York in her early 20s. And it's an essay about her decision to leave New York and move home after spending years there in her early 20s. And I am also a writer who left New York in my 20s, though I am not famous like Joan Didion or like the folks in this essay collection. Essentially, it's an essay collection of people who loved and left New York in their 20s. And so really great writers in there, but it's all these reflections about like why that city means so much to people and why it was so magical in that time of their life, and then why they made the decision to leave. And so it's a very emotional and impactful read for me. But that essay is one that if you bring it up to people, like they also start telling you their New York stories. So I think it's probably one that's got a lot of magic to other people as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that. I'm a big bookworm, so I love book recommendations.
Absolutely.
And speaking of books, are there any books or films? There are so many now. I mean, there used to not really be very much, but now there are more and more books coming out about the fashion industry. Are there any favorites or, specific recommendations that, if there's someone who's listening who wants to learn more about the fashion industry and get involved in fashion activism, what kind of stands out for you? Because with so many choices, it could be overwhelming to choose what to get started with.
Yeah, so of course, I want to recommend The Conscious Closet and Overdressed by my Remake colleague, Elizabeth Klein. Those books are excellent. And The Conscious Closet in particular is a great starting place for folks interested in learning more about this. And then I also want to recommend Consumed by Aja Barber, which is a new release. I just think that the way this book talks about class and privilege in fashion and consumption is unmatched. So it's a good book if you are just dipping your toe in, because Aja delivers her messages, in a straightforward way. But if you've read a lot about the sustainable fashion space, it's also really important for you to read, because I think that book touches on the topics in a way that's really new and different.
Yeah, Aja lends a really great perspective, and I agree with all of those recommendations.
Seconded.
So, one thing that I struggle with, and I think a lot of us are struggling with, is this kind of eco anxiety in the world, and now so many other, there's just so many crazy things going on in the world. But if we're going to keep up this work, we have to stay optimistic. And so, what makes you feel optimistic about the future?
Yeah, when you asked this question, two things came to mind. So the first is just like working in the vintage shop, the cool young people who come in loving secondhand. Like they're already just so obsessed with it, and they want to show me the things that they've made, and they're picking up sewing again and doing DIYs and are proud to be shopping secondhand. And I think that's so cool. And that generation is going to have a foundation for it that my generation older than me didn't have, because we got so swept up in fast fashion in those formative years. And so I think that's really cool to see. And then the other thing is like the remake community, it's having people to be around you, to wrap their arms around you when you're doing this difficult work and show that support. And that's what being in community is all about.
Amazing. Thank you for sharing that. And you talked a little bit about Preloved Podcast, but I definitely want to make sure that you can just tell everyone a little bit about your podcast and how they can find you, and check that out as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. So yeah, if you want to stay in touch, my username across most all platforms is Emily M. Stochl. My last name is spelled Stochl. And then Preloved Podcast is a weekly interview show about vintage and secondhand fashion. So I interview folks from all over the vintage and secondhand fashion space. And it's available wherever you stream podcasts. So if you search Preloved Podcast in Apple or Spotify, it will come up. And we've been going on since 2018. So there's hundreds of episodes for you to download and check out today. And a new one comes out each week about all things vintage and secondhand.
Amazing. That's so fun. Well, anything else you want to add before we say goodbye?
I would just like to say, would really love to have everybody who's listening think about taking the No New Clothes pledge this summer. It's really a supportive community endeavor, and we would love to have you take that first step toward building a relationship with fashion that you really feel good about.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for taking time to talk with us today.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. And I hope you have a great rest of your day. And bye, everyone. See you next time.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to the Swap Society podcast. Swap Society is an online clothing swap for women and kids that makes it easy and affordable to mix up your wardrobe sustainably. We're a growing community of women across the USA who are creating positive change by swapping our clothes and slowing down our fashion consumption. We would love to swap with you. If you're interested in joining, you can sign up at our website. Learn more at www.swapsociety.co. That's swapsociety.co. You can find the show notes for each episode on our website. Please get in touch with us on social media too. We're on Instagram, TikTok, Pinterest, and YouTube for the video version of this podcast at Swap Society. Music is by Joel Korolitz and yours truly. I hope you've enjoyed the show. Please help us spread the word by subscribing, leaving a rating and review, sharing on social media, or simply telling a friend. We really appreciate your support. Have a wonderful day, and remember to swap before you shop.